Welcome everybody to our weekly Cyber Policy Center lunch. I'm Nate Persily. I'm co-director of the Cyber Policy Center. We are thrilled today to have Brittan Heller join us to talk about all the work that she's been doing on virtual reality, augmented reality, and the like. She was a fellow here for much of the last year and is currently a lecturer here in the law school teaching international human rights law. She is also on the steering committee for the World Economic Forum's Metaverse Governance Initiative, studied content moderation as an inaugural AI and tech fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Carr Center for Human Rights. She's a visiting fellow at the Yale Information Society Project, a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab, and was, as I said, here for much of the last year. And so, as is traditional, we will have Brittan talk for about half an hour, and then afterwards we'll take questions both from the audience and those of you who are online. If you're online, send your questions through the Q&A function, and they will magically appear on my phone. So without further ado, please welcome Brittan Heller.
All right, I have heard from people online that it's hard to hear, so normally I walk. You're just going to see me gesture like mad. I'm going to start with a story today. And some of you have heard this story, but it has more salience this week, where on Friday we will see the commercial release of the Apple Vision Pro, which is being touted as the first commercial spatial computing headset. Meta previously released its Quest 3, but that has been really touted as an entertainment-based headset. So I'm going to start with a story about a race car. So Nate Persily and Brittan Heller are in their Apple Vision Pro, and they decide that they are going to play a race car game. Nate, what car do you drive?
Audi.
Nate drives an Audi. Brittan is pleased by this choice because she drives a red McLaren. And does Brittan like this red McLaren? When she sees this car, her pupils dilate, her skin gets a little more moist, and her heart rate starts to go up. Later on, while Brittan is going around the metaverse, doing her thing, going in the Apple Vision Pro, trying to do her work, accessing all of our Microsoft applications through the Quest 3, strange things start to happen. She starts getting targeted advertisements in her email about why it's a great time to renew her car insurance. She goes into a virtual sports bar, and somebody who looks a lot like someone she thinks is super sexy asks her what kind of car does she drive. Later on, when she goes back into the racing game, having advanced to the championships after beating Nate, she sees a red McLaren drive by, and it's driven by somebody who looks remarkably like Brittan. This sounds like science fiction, but it's not. All of the capabilities that I described to you are already present in software and hardware that you can buy at Best Buy. 6 months ago, our colleagues at Berkeley used a study based off of head and hand motion in Beat Saber. And if you're not familiar with Beat Saber, it is the most popular, most commercially successful VR game. They used approximately 1,000 people and gauged how their heads moved and how their hands moved. They then used machine learning models to guess 40 different personal attributes of people based on ranging from their gender and their age to their substance use habits and their disability status. The studiers said that using these simple machine learning models, they were able to accurately attribute over 40 personal attributes that could be inferred from VR motion data alone. I'm here to talk to you today about what replaces our cell phones, what replaces our laptops, and this is what I call the embodied web. It will open new frontiers for privacy law, for digital governance, and for the misfit or misalignment of pre-existing law based on different hardware and new data flows that will differentiate this from traditional flat screen computing. I'm going to give you 4 points to take away today to help you understand what I mean when I say the embodied web and why it's important. First, as the examples show, your digital exhaust in a spatial computing environment contains more than you'd think. You give off more data than you realize when you are in spatial computing or when you are captured by someone else who is using a spatial computing headset. I say the embodied web because you need data coming from your bodily measurements, your reaction to stimuli, and the way you move to calibrate these extended reality headsets. When I say extended reality, I mean virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality altogether. What is different about this than traditional flat screen computing is you can't opt out. If you try to opt out of body-based data collection, the device cannot be calibrated for your environment, it cannot be calibrated for your body, it will not work. Traditional web takes in data flows like content, conduct, and behavior-based data. Location-based data was a new addition with the onset of mobile computing around 2009. You need location-based data when you are in spatial computing, and this is for user safety. You need to map out your physical space so you don't run into a wall, so you don't trip over a cat, so you don't run into other people. The location-based data helps orient where you are in a virtual environment. So what's different with embodied computing? Well, the spatial web adds sensory-based data and movement-based data. This is highly accurate and intimate data that also implicates behavioral and inferential data. So it looks different based on the type of information that the computer needs to make itself work. Right now, there is little visibility as to the data flows in your spatial data. I'm very lucky in that there was a Washington Post article this morning about this, so I'm going to quote to you from this, where the journalist asked about the protection of location-based data and bystander privacy-based data in the Apple Vision Pro, and got some feedback from Apple. So Apple reported that to combat people being surreptitiously filmed with the Apple Vision Pro, there's an indicator on the device's front screen when it's shooting a photo or taking a video. And this isn't new. If you look at other AR devices, Meta has an indicator light on its Ray-Ban stories. So these look like normal Ray-Ban frames. Look like anyone wearing Ray-Ban sunglasses, except there's a little light right here that blinks or turns on when you're capturing video or images to try to let people around you know that that's occurring. So that's standard. Apple isn't allowing third-party Vision Pro apps to access the camera to capture photos and videos. And they're trying to prevent third-party apps from running facial recognition algorithms on people while you're looking at them. That's good. That's a pretty good development. The flip side of that is that it indicates that Apple is planning to be reliant on third-party app developers. There's also a difference when you're looking at definitions between eye tracking, gaze vectors, or gaze tracking, and pupil tracking. And you need to pay attention because this is where companies get a little bit cute. Eye tracking is what you're looking at in a dynamic form. So your eyes are moving, and what are you actually looking at? A gaze vector or gaze tracking is the general area where you're looking. And if you look at the privacy policies for VR and AR headsets, some will talk about gaze vectors or gaze tracking as opposed to eye tracking, and vice versa. So you need to know what type of data they're putting in there. Is it general? Is it specific? Or is it highly targeted? There's also pupil tracking data, which is your reaction to stimuli, how your body reacts to the specific thing that you're looking at. As you can see, that creates kind of a spectrum of highly invasive to highly personal to general data, but they all are being described as eye tracking by the media and by the general public. The responsibility seems to be put on developers under Apple's privacy protections. So the Washington Post points to a website for Vision Pro developers and warns the developers, it's your responsibility to protect any data your app collects and to use it in responsible and privacy-preserving ways. That does not make me feel better. I don't know about you, but it seems like there is a risk inherent here in setting up mass violations of public trust. If the definitions aren't clear, if the responsibility seems to be mediated between developers of software and developers of hardware, it seems like the situation that led us to some of the violations of public trust we saw with social media recurring anew. Where the motion data is being streamed into the cloud, Apple has very little visibility into what happens to it after it leaves the device. And this is another area you want to pay attention to, because the chips in these new spatial computing headsets are powerful, but they are not powerful enough to do all of the data processing on device. Doing your data processing on device is a best practice if you want to be really privacy protected, because after it touches the cloud, you have more privacy and data security exposure for all of the information gathered in your computer, which in this case is your headset. One of the researchers interviewed in the Washington Post article says, because this data can't be completely eliminated from most applications, he means motion-based data, he suggests to develop a privacy-preserving tool for VR motion data. That will not come by Friday. So, and it's not currently available. The second point I want to make is that existing traditional flat-screen internet-based computing is not designed to accommodate this information. And one of the examples that I'm going to give to you is content moderation. So a lot of people think about content moderation as a bedrock of internet governance and self-governance for platforms. Who's heard of Lego Universe? A few people. Back in 2012, Lego Universe was a highly anticipated, massive multiplayer online universe. If you think about Roblox or Minecraft, this was supposed to be a Lego-branded entry into that sort of a platform. Kids were supposed to be able to go on there and create their Lego-based virtual worlds with the imprimatur of Lego's family-friendly brand. The experience actually looked great, and people were really excited about allowing users to build their own environments in virtual worlds. Especially given how utterly trusted the Lego brand was by parents, the company proactively committed to do robust content moderation in the Lego universe. There is a spicy term in content moderation. I learned it from someone in this room. It is called time to penis. What I mean by time to penis is the interval between someone entering a virtual world and explicit content appearing in the virtual world. For Lego Universe, with all puns intended, it was not very long. Lego needed to, amongst other things, prevent users from publishing environments with adult content in it. But they found that they could not create an automated, scalable, economic way to allow users from creating adult content in their 3D worlds. This became a wide-scale problem. They would have to have individually monitored each world, and they just didn't have the money, the time, the resources, or the technological capability to automate it. So the project was killed. Social media content moderation on flat-screen internet looks to actors, behaviors, and content. For example, one might analyze a user's posted content on a social media platform to determine if it's hate speech, self-harm, pornography, or explicit content. Separately, the content moderations on the internet look at a user's conduct to determine if they're harassing people through constant messaging, sending out spam, abusing a platform by making repeated false reports. You can't do that template in a 3D world based on the technological constraints that we have right now using AI. Content moderation in spatial computing has to consider both conduct and content, like an internet-based platform, but it also must address the environment in which the content or the conduct occurs. So in social XR, in extended reality, we have individual 3D experiences which you can think about like software. There's a conduct layer which hosts user-to-user interactions and interactivity between users and the environment. And there's conduct about how people treat each other within the world, but there's also environment, and this is the architecture of these 3D worlds along with the digital objects that users use to populate the worlds. No one will want to go to a 3D world with nothing in it. There is no 3D world without 3D walls. Those are two new vectors that you will need to try to moderate conduct if content moderation moves into spatial computing. Right now, there is not enough data for 3D classifiers to do this in an automated way. Spatial computing, computer vision is giving us an opportunity to do that, but frankly, there's just not enough data yet to do this in an accurate and timely fashion like you would need to automate a virtual world to the same levels of safety as you would have to moderate a spatial world with the same level of safety that you would moderate an internet-based platform. Additionally, there's different forms of spatial computing, and there's different form factors that will expose content moderation-based environmental risks. A pair of AR-based glasses and a self-contained VR headset have different risk vectors. So if you think about a user designing a strip club in a VR space and putting it next to a space designed for children, it's in a self-contained universe, so it's just for people in that world. With AR glasses, the risk could be more like putting adult content on a pre-existing physical space, so the layering of physical and digital computing. That's what I mean when I talk about the embodied web, the hybrid of physical and digital space, which will require us to look at the risks that users will face in that environment in a novel way. We have to start to ask ourselves what user-generated content will look like in 3D systems and how existing laws will integrate with these systems. This leads me to my next point, where we don't know how the law will treat body-based data. And I say body-based data explicitly instead of biometric data because we know how the law treats biometric data. This could be different. Privacy law is premised on personal identifying information, and this is much more attenuated and specific in spatial computing. There was a study that was done here at Stanford by Mark Miller of the Virtual Human Interaction Lab in 2020. And they took about 2,000 people and recorded their movements in VR, 100 seconds of recording. And they found that they were able, based off of their motion-based data, to uniquely identify one person in the crowd of 2,000 people. That's pretty impressive. Berkeley says to Stanford and decides to do it again with a data set of 55,000 people using the same interval using the same type of motion-based data, they could uniquely identify one person out of 55,000 based on the way they tilted their head and pointed. So in spatial computing, the way you tilt your head and point is as physically identifying as your fingerprint. This may stretch the limits of biometrics law. This doesn't mean there will be no coverage. If you look at certain statutes like the GDPR, spatial data may be covered as highly sensitive or sensitive data, but it's uncertain that coverage will be uniform worldwide, especially in jurisdictions like the US, where privacy law is delegated to state-based law. If you consider non-consensual intimate images and the fight to prohibit that on internet-based computing, it took until 2013 to get 48 state coverage. And this was a harm that had celebrity-based advocacy and a lot of legal superstars working on the effort to get nationwide coverage for non-consensual intimate images, which are sometimes called revenge porn. 3, you observe the World Wide Web, but you experience the embodied web. I think it's quite clear from this point in my talk that I think this is not like social media. This is something completely different based on from other types of computing that have come before. And if you look at neuroscience, you have more proof for this. Why? Because your body and your mind react differently to flat screen internet-based content than they do to spatial content. This is because of 3 characteristics. Jeremy Bailenson from the Virtual Human Interaction Lab defined these. They're called presence, immersion, and embodiment. Presence has been studied in communications departments for decades, and this is defined as the illusion of non-mediation, meaning that when XR is done right, there are no gadgets, there is no helmet, it's the magic and the music and you. You do not, in other words, spatial computing and XR feels real. Jeremy said that we should think of VR not as a media experience, but closer to an actual experience. And to underscore this, if you take a tour of the lab with Jeremy or my other colleagues there, the first thing that we have you do is walk the plank over a pit. And we brought some EU regulators over there, people who wrote the GDPR and who knew, they knew it was a computer. They knew they were watching screens in a self-contained headsets. They still crawled across the floor. They still talked about their heart racing and feeling vertigo, feeling it in your body in a way that you don't when you read something on the internet, even if you get angry. So before people at the lab talk to you about empathy, before we talk about education, we demonstrate one of the long historical successes of XR, which is treating phobias like the fear of heights through use of spatial computing. Immersion means that users feel like they're really in a virtual environment. And if you're a theater nerd, this is how you set the scene. A virtual opera has to have all of the trappings of experiencing it in the physical world, including different views from different seats, movement flows through aisles, spatially oriented sound that appears to come from different parts of the theater, and low light when the performance starts. So the way that this all comes from the way that spatial computing experiences use sensory input to stimulate the user, including light, sounds, tactile stimuli, and even sense. If you go to the lab, we can have you roast a marshmallow over a virtual campfire. And you smell the marshmallow, and you hear the campfire, and then you smell the charcoal. What's interesting to me is that studies say that that's great and that enhances it, but you actually don't need it to feel like the campfire is real. The third characteristic, and the one that I think is the biggest difference from flat screen computing, is embodiment. And this is feeling like the form of an avatar or a virtual body is one's actual body. Professor Mel Slater demonstrated the importance of this by doing something called the rubber hand illusion. And if you've taken psychology classes, you might have learned about the rubber hand illusion. To move it into VR, researchers placed a toy hand in a user's field of vision when they were in a VR headset. And then the researchers went Looney Tunes on it, and they took a mallet and they hit the virtual hand. And people reacted like you all just did. They jumped a little bit. Some of them jumped more than a little bit, and they screamed and yelled and reported feeling pain like their actual hand had been hit by a mallet. The researchers found that users who watched violence or abuse inflicted on the toy hand interpreted it like it was happening to their own body, to their own hand, as a real bodily experience. This is why I call it the embodied web. So embodiment is very powerful. It can be beneficial. You can use VR just like you use mirrors to create an illusion that allows people to treat phantom limb pain. You can use it to, in an educational context, to engender empathy. But you can also place users at increased risk, considering the violence and harassment that many users have reported in social XR environments. These characteristics lead to different psychological and neurological impacts for users. It's not like reading harsh words on the head. Tom Furness, who invented one of the first VR headsets, talked about how an experience in VR is like it's written on the brain in permanent ink. There are pluses for this. With training and education, this is the most powerful tool for learning we've ever invented as a society. But it also means that an assault on your virtual body in the metaverse feels like an assault on your body. Because of how spatial experiences can feel real, online harms transfer from flat screen computing to spatial computing in a more visceral way. Experiences are processed through your hippocampus when you are in spatial computing. And this is the same way that you create memories when you are in the physical world. And that's a very different process than reading descriptions of behavior on a flat screen, traditional internet-based environment. Considering the targeting of women and girls, it's important to think about how this translates into a spatial computing-based environment. In 2016, a journalist writing under the pseudonym Jordan Bellemere reported being groped within 2 minutes of entering a virtual archery game, and wrote about how it felt like a real violation to her. The platform responded and created personal space bubbles, which was a good development, but it didn't really stop things. A VR professional named Nina Jane Patel publicly wrote about a sexual assault in the metaverse in 2022, which happened in Horizon Worlds. Interestingly, earlier this month, the first case was filed for sexual assault of a minor in a virtual world in the UK. And this was a 16-year-old girl who reported being sexually assaulted in the metaverse. It is legally unclear if the court will require physical touching as an element of the crime like they would for a sexual assault in the real world, but what law enforcement has made it clear that they took the case anyway because of the psychological damage to the minor. This is because spatial computing impacts our bodies and our minds very differently. Fourth, AI and virtual worlds are going to continue to grow closer. So the metaverse is not dead. It is a part of a constellation of emerging technologies. And to focus on one part of the constellation in lieu of other components means you will have an incomplete picture. And if you were looking at regulatory or legislative impacts, you need to consider the full picture. algorithms are needed to fuel virtual worlds. AI is playing an increasingly important role in generating these 3D environments and populating the objects for them. Multimodal input allows you to go to any off-the-shelf generative AI platform without a sophisticated understanding of coding and to create objects for your 3D worlds. Some of these objects can even be other people. And now they can have voices and movements and interact with you as if they are another person offline. AI may help with governance to some extent. There's a white paper that came out from OpenAI that talks about the tools that generative AI will offer content moderators for flat screen internet, and that's great. AI may even help create simulated virtual worlds for creating more data sets for computer vision, because one of the main problems is we don't have enough data to create robust computer vision-based data sets yet. AI is also integral to how we process body-based data. And I've talked about eyes and hands. And now I'm going to talk about voice. Last month, Meta introduced a new capability called audio to photoreal. And this is where your avatars in XR will mirror your facial expressions and generate corresponding bodily gestures based on audio alone. These are full-bodied, photorealistic avatars. Not only do they have legs, they look like actual feet. They will mirror your body expressions, they will mirror your facial expressions and generate bodily movements based on the author's voice and on the voice alone. So the body motion of the avatar is synthesized through a diffusion model conditioned on the audio or text input, and the facial motion is audio conditioned from another diffusion model constructed from the audio input. So if you say, "Ay caramba," like Bart Simpson, the avatar will do that, and it will make the appropriate face based on your tone of voice, your pitch, your modulation. You don't need a camera anymore for body-based data. You need other sensors, but if we focus explicitly on cameras, like the indicators are for bystander consent, we're also going to miss a part of the bigger picture. This impacts depictions of the mouth, the face, and the hands without the use of motion tracking. The body and face follow different dynamics, where the face is strongly correlated with the input audio and the body has a weaker correlation with the speech. So I'm going to end here because my time is up, but I want to emphasize that the move to what I'm calling the embodied web will open new frontiers for privacy law, for digital governance, and for new types of online harms based on different hardware, different software, and new data flows. So thank you very much, and looking forward to your questions.
About it, or that there are special problems. So if we had to like sort of rattle off what we think that the differences are between, like as you said, the embodied web and existing platforms, social media, or just our internet experience. I gather you feel there's increased risk of privacy violations. The issue about assault. I mean, what would be the litany of unique problems that we see in the virtual world that are so significantly different than what we're seeing in the existing internet that we need to be concerned about it?
There have been some really good papers. My favorite one is by Mark Lemley and Eugene Volokh that talks, that kind of gives an omnibus view of what this landscape could look like. And it's my favorite one because it really holds true to how the technology is developing. I think looking at content moderation is the major difference for me based on the visceral user impacts, but there are lots of other realms as well that can be impacted. One is really looking at criminal and civil procedure. So looking at questions based on jurisdiction. That one I think will have more answers to when you look at countries like the UK that are trying to be really forward. If the UK does it, I anticipate other countries like Australia that are seen as very, very forward in online harms prevention and response. I can see them taking action as well. I can also see other countries trying to differentiate themselves from American legal milieus. Like China just announced that they are going to create a board that studies spatial computing, and they have representatives from all 6 of their major XR companies, and it's different than what's happening in the US because they're paying attention to it. So you may see some movement in international law that will create different treatment of virtual worlds in different parts of the physical world. It's not that we haven't dealt with these problems before. Like the internet had to figure out how to create jurisdictional solutions when people were really spread out and disparate. But a lot of those solutions were premised on physical location. And so that's going to be, that could be potentially challenging here if a lot of the data in XR is really ephemeral. We didn't get to that in the talk, but that is also one of the main challenges where if you report a violation of terms of service in Horizon Worlds on Meta, you can record 2 minutes of an interaction. That's really not enough. That's oftentimes not enough to get the full context of what's going on. It's really, really noisy because it picks up all the background noise of what's going on as well. So it's giving a content moderator 2 minutes of chaos and then asking them to be a referee about what happened, and applying that to a different set of rules than the Blue App Facebook social media rules. The content otherwise disappears, so if someone reports and hasn't recorded it, then it's gone. And there's really nothing that can be done. I want
to talk about policy, but let's start with a question over here, and if there were hands over here, please raise them. Yeah.
Thanks. I noticed that you started with the Apple Vision Pro, and I haven't seen it in real. I mean, I don't think any of us have, but I've seen the video. And I wonder, you talked about it having a light of some sort if you record people. But I thought what could potentially be special about this is that, of course, you can have degrees of being inside the virtual world and degrees of being in the real world. So this raises the new problem, to my mind, that what if somebody interacts with you, either another person with a headset or from real, and they don't know how much in there or how much in real you are at that time? I mean, that may have legal implications, such as, you know, if you came up to me and you don't know how much I'm in there, you punch me, and I don't know that you're there punching me, then I might not evade you and therefore be punched. That kind of scenario. I mean, you can spin it out in different ways, but you know, that to my mind is the new thing about this particular device.
I think that's a good observation. This is why my friends call me the lawyer of the Black Mirror, because I don't I don't know of other law professors who are asked to imagine that kind of scenario in the course of ordinary business. But I think you're right to point out that mixed reality will have different form factors and different risks than augmented reality and virtual reality. At this point, I've seen many of the things I've seen have indicators that you are entering a virtual space. So I think it's incumbent on developers to really use digital architecture to help acclimate people to the new social expectations and norms of spaces that they're developing. I also see Apple as making a different play than Meta. Apple wants you to use this to replace your iMac. They want it to be for enterprise and everyday work use, and that's why it's important to them that you can toggle in and out and not have to take your headset off. Meta wants you to use it for gaming and fun. And they did the typical oopsies where you can also now use your Microsoft applications on it because they don't want to lose that entire market. But that's not the primary thrust of their headset. Philip Rosedale, who invented Second Life, said something at a conference that we held here last year. He said that the people who feel comfortable in these environments are the same people who feel comfortable being blindfolded in a public space. Which, if you think about it, gives you some goosebumps first, but also implicitly underscores the value proposition for mixed reality, where it can be more inclusive because then people can have more control over both the physical and the digital realm.
Well, and as the mic goes to Daphne, let's just pursue this. I think part of the challenge here is that that everyone has the Quest or Vision Pro as the model that we're going to. It's like, all right, we're going to decide when we're in virtual environments, and we're going to decide when we're not. But the more that this gets incorporated into like actual glasses that people are wearing, it's sort of going to be seamless. You're driving down the street and you'll know what's on a menu in a restaurant because essentially your glasses could have the information there. Sort of you incorporate Yelp into your field of vision and things like that. And so one of the challenges here, I think, is to kind of define the problem that you're trying to solve, because there are different types of problems depending on whether you self-consciously have opted into a virtual world or whether it's essentially become this kind of continuum of actual reality to virtual reality. And then Daphne has a question after that. Yeah.
I think the question of the continuum will become more salient as we see more software and experiences developed for enterprise-based apps. Right now, it's Meta intentionally did not put a little screen in their Ray-Ban stories because they didn't want people using it while driving. They wanted to make sure that it had a lot of the capabilities of your cell phone but didn't distract people. It's interesting because I think there's two reasons why they did that. One is the reason that you said, like public safety and confusion and social acclimation to new hardware. The second was that they could have done it. They actually have the micro LCD technology to make a little screen in your field of view. It was prohibitively expensive at this point to put that in there. That is the new magic of the Apple device, where it's really the first thing that is allowing a physical digital hybridized space in a way that is seamless and adaptable.
Definitely.
So I guess this is a pretty basic question. How much should we expect VR and AR to share the issues of AI, to be powered by AI and to share the issues in particular of hallucinations, which would be kind of a wild thing in virtual reality, and secondly of limitations based on compute or processing power or electricity, you know, et cetera, that might make it not really a scalable thing for everybody to be using all the time?
That is a really good question. I view them as pretty synonymous because of a few developments. One is the move to cloud, so the new headsets are all, they all have 5G capabilities so that they can stream data. Earlier manifestations were all tethered, and I think I would have had a different answer for you a year and a half ago when the most powerful headset was tethered. The headset that I think is the best headset is actually still tethered because of the enhanced capability that gives it for rendering, for image processing, for frame rate, for lots of different things. It's called the Vario. It comes out of Finland. It is more expensive than the Apple Vision Pro, but not much, and it's designed for industrial use. I think the challenges with AI are going to all manifest in the software, not just because they're being used in tandem, but because they're at a similar place in their regulatory maturity and adoption cycle. Everybody has talked about the metaverse as being a thing for the last 6 years. Not everybody, but just a lot of pundity people like all of us. And I think that was detrimental because when they said that, they meant social VR as Mark Zuckerberg intended it to be. If you look at the embodied web as physical digital hybrid space, that's already here, and we access that through our phones, through wearables, and it's not just that AI is fueling the capabilities of these devices, it's that AI is shaping the capabilities of physical digital hybridized space and helping us expand the universe of what's possible. When people ask me, like, what do you look for in kind of XR regulation, I actually tell them to look to AI-based regulations, because they're at the same point, because there is still the need to define fundamental issues, and because there is an evolution of harms in the same way.
Mark.
Great, very interesting. So I want to ask about bleed back in the other direction, right? So not how do we sort of like change law to adapt to VR, but how does sort of VR change the way we might think of other legal doctrines? And in particular, I want to focus on the idea that you highlighted of sort of how visceral, how real it feels, even though it is not in fact physically present, right? And the law, in particular ways, in criminal law, in First Amendment law, draws a pretty sharp distinction between remoteness and proximity, between words and actions. And I guess I wonder whether VR, by blurring that line, sort of ought to tell us something about sort of what the rules ought to be, not just in VR but elsewhere, right? Should we be drawing a line quite that starkly between those who are next to you and those who are far away?
That's a great question. This is actually what excites me a lot about this new technology, because it means we have to look at pre-existing legal doctrine through the lens of where is the locus of harm and where is the manifestation of that harm, where does that have judicial significance? And so I'm really morbidly excited by the UK case, because that's there's been a lot of theoretical discussion for the last few years about treating online harms in a similar way to physical harms because of the impact on the person. But this actually drills down and is going to test what impact actually means.
This is the groping case, or which case is this?
This is the UK case that is trying to look at a 16-year-old who was sexually assaulted in the metaverse and trying to charge it as a sexual assault. I anticipate they're going to have, like, the briefing is going to be very, very interesting for that, because the defense can say, like, the woman was never actually touched. And then the women's attorneys, I anticipate, are going to turn to psychological harm and the purpose and intent of the law. And so I can see that as the start of a dialogue where we look at what that means, and maybe not just in criminal law, but you've seen the seed of these discussions in property law. If you're looking about other types of virtual property, like NFTs and the theft of NFTs, and so I see it drawing from other legal regimes in a really rich way, where we look at virtual objects, virtual valuation, and virtual property and persons as warranting re-examination.
So if you were to be sort of queen for a day and to come up with, where would you start if you're trying to craft a regulatory regime to deal with spatial computing, VR, XR, AR? What's the sort of first problem you tackle? What would that look like? What would the regulation look like?
I would handle body-based data.
So mainly this is data protection / privacy rules.
Yeah, looking at biometric data, what is covered and what is not, and in particular the role of the behavioral, medical, and inferential data that you can get from these data flows.
And so would you ban the collection of that, or do you think it's just about consent or that preventing the sale of it or whatever it would be? I mean, is it the same? How similar is this to whether you're talking about wearables or you're talking about even stuff that social media companies or Google or whatever are collecting on us? Draw me out there as to what the legal regime looks like.
I wouldn't ban the collection and use, because then you can't use this hardware. But I would, I think I would take an EU-based approach, looking at the application and uses of that data, and so looking at specific manifestations of it. One that's top of mind is I would not allow targeted advertising to be based on your involuntary body responses, because I don't feel like you can meaningfully consent to that. I would look at what consent means in embodied data-based regimes and re-examine the question of meaningfully informed consent. I actually have a paper coming out that I did for the UN Population Fund, looking at the international law around consent and how that changes when you move into a spatial environment. Mostly how it impacts technologically facilitated gender-based violence. But do we need to reconceive of what consent means in a computing system that is fed by our bodies?
So right now, whether Vision Pro or Quest, is it basically just boilerplate? I consent to a hell of a lot of data collection by Facebook or Apple.
Yeah.
That they
basically, with limitations on what they'll give to the third-party developers, but Apple in particular is being very cagey about how they're going to notify people about how this data is applied, what the data, how it's being stored, where it's being stored, how it's being used. I think it's. I understand why they don't have this all figured out yet, because it's technically very, very challenging. However, they're releasing the headset on Friday, so it's to me, I think they're going to end up playing catch up and hope nothing goes seriously wrong in the interim.
Are there any countries that you think are doing this, or thinking about this the right way? Like, if you had to point to a model, I mean, you mentioned GDPR. We know, we've now got several years under that regime, but whether it's privacy or seriously thinking about regulating VR, is there a model that we should point to?
Maybe the UK, but they tend to be over robust about things. So no country stands out yet.
All right. Well, thank you. Please join me in thanking Brittan Heller. Next week, I believe we've got Professor Spencer Overton. Is that right? And he'll be talking about AI and multiracial democracy. So please join us again next week.